Derek Matthews had always believed that attention was the most valuable currency in the world. At 32, he had built a modest following on social media by creating content that pushed boundaries and generated controversy. His YouTube channel, Derek's Daily Disruption, specialized in pranks and public confrontations that often left his targets embarrassed and his viewers entertained. On this particular Thursday morning, Derek was feeling the pressure. His subscriber count had been stagnant for months, and his latest videos had received lukewarm responses. He needed something big, something that would go viral and remind people why they should be watching his content. As he walked through the streets of London with his camera equipment, looking for inspiration, found himself near Buckingham Palace. The sight of the royal guards immediately sparked an idea. These silent, stoic figures had always annoyed Derek. He saw them as pretentious relics of an outdated system, standing around in ridiculous uniforms while ordinary people struggled with real problems. The fact that they were trained not to react to provocation made them perfect targets for his particular brand of content. Derek had brought his portable megaphone today, originally planning to use it for some street interviews. But as he watched tourists taking selfies with the guards, he realized he had found his next viral moment.
Oh yeah.
He would break these guards, make them react, and show his audience that even the most disciplined people had their limits. Setting up his camera on a tripod, about 20 feet away, Derek began recording. He started with what he considered gentle mockery, using the megaphone to make jokes about the guards' uniforms and their rigid posture. A small crowd began to gather, some people laughing at his commentary while others looked uncomfortable with. The situation the guard Derek had chosen as his primary target was a young man who couldn't have been more than 25. His name tag read Williams, and despite the verbal assault beginning to rain down on him, his expression remained completely neutral. His eyes stared straight ahead, and his posture never wavered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Derek announced into his megaphone, his voice echoing off the palace walls, "we have here a prime example of what happens when people take themselves too seriously. This young man thinks he's protecting something important by standing still and looking grumpy." Crowd's reaction was mixed. Some tourists pulled out their phones to record the spectacle, while others began to move away, clearly disapproving of Derek's behavior. But Derek was energized by any reaction, positive or negative. Controversy meant engagement, and engagement meant views. Derek moved closer to guard Williams, his megaphone now projecting his voice at an uncomfortable volume directly toward the young soldier. "Can you imagine choosing this as your career?" he continued. "Standing around like a department store mannequin while real people do actual work to keep society functioning?" Still, the guard showed no reaction. His breathing remained steady, his eyes focused on some distant point beyond the crowd. Derek found this lack of response both frustrating and encouraging. The more stoic the guard remained, the more dramatic it would be when Derek finally broke through his composure. "I bet you're wondering what goes through his mind all day, Derek," said, addressing his audience while keeping the megaphone pointed at Williams. "Does he think about his grocery list? Does he daydream about having a real job? Or is his brain just as empty as his stare?" A middle-aged woman in the crowd called out, "That's enough. Leave him alone." But Derek dismissed her concern with a wave of his hand. It was just getting started, and he could already imagine the comments his video would generate. Derek began to circle the guard like a predator stalking prey, his commentary becoming more personal and cruel. "Look at this face," he announced to his growing audience. "This is the face of someone who gave, upon having actual dreams or ambitions. This is what happens when you settle for being a tourist attraction instead of a real person." The guard's composure never cracked, but Derek thought he detected the slightest tightening around the young man's eyes. It was barely perceptible, but it gave Derek hope that he was getting under the guard's skin. He decided to escalate his approach. "I wonder what his family thinks about his career choice," Derek mused into the megaphone, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Can you imagine going to school reunions and telling people you dress up like a toy soldier for a living? How do you explain that to your children?" The crowd was growing larger now, drawn by the spectacle and the increasing volume of Derek's commentary. Some people were recording with their phones, which delighted Derek, Every additional camera meant more potential for his content to spread across social media platforms. Derek's assistant, a young woman named Jenny, who helped him with his videos, looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction the content was taking. She had signed up to help with harmless pranks and interviews, not public humiliation of people who couldn't defend themselves. "Derek," she whispered during a brief pause in his monologue, "maybe we should wrap this up. People are starting to look really upset." But Derek was riding high on adrenaline and the promise of viral content. He waved Jenny off and returned his attention to the guard, who continued to stand perfectly still despite the ongoing verbal assault. "The best part about this job," Derek announced to his audience, "is that he literally cannot defend himself. He's trained to just stand there and take whatever anyone dishes out. It's like having a human punching bag, except instead of physical abuse, we're giving him the psychological kind." As Derek spoke these words, he noticed something in the guard's eyes that he hadn't seen before. It wasn't anger or hurt, but something deeper, something that looked almost like pity. This confused Derek, who was expecting to see signs of breaking. Composure, not what appeared to be sympathy for his tormentor. The afternoon sun was getting stronger, and Derek realized he had been at this for over an hour. The guard had shown remarkable endurance, standing perfectly still while being subjected to constant ridicule. Part of Derek grudgingly respected this discipline, even as he continued his assault. But Derek's goal wasn't respect. His goal was content that would generate views, comments, and subscribers. And he was convinced that if he just pushed a little harder, he could get the reaction that would make this video legendary. Derek's second hour of harassment was even more intense than the first. He had discovered that personal attacks seemed to get the strongest reactions from his audience, so he doubled down on that approach. The megaphone amplified not just his voice, but his cruelty, sending his mocking words echoing across the palace grounds. "I've been thinking," Derek announced to his steadily growing audience, "about what kind of person actively chooses to be a human statue. What happens in your childhood that makes you think, you know what I want to be when I grow up?" It's completely useless. The crowd around them had evolved throughout the morning. The initial group of curious tourists had largely been replaced by people who had specifically come to watch Derek's performance after seeing clips shared on social media. Some were supporters who found his content entertaining, while others seemed to be there hoping to witness his comeuppance. Guard Williams maintained his perfect posture. But Derek had begun to notice small details that suggested the prolonged harassment was taking its toll. There was a slight pallor to the young man's skin. Derek thought he could see tiny beads of sweat forming despite the cool London weather. "Are you getting tired, my friend?" Derek asked, moving even closer to the guard. "Starting to wonder if this is really worth minimum wage? Because I'm betting that's about what they pay you to stand around and be decorative." Jenny, Derek's assistant, had been growing increasingly agitated as the morning progressed. She had initially agreed to help with Derek's content because she believed in pushing boundaries and challenging authority, but what she was witnessing felt less like social commentary and more like prolonged bullying of someone who couldn't fight back. "Derek," she said, pulling him aside during a brief pause, "this has gone on long enough. You've made your point. Can we move on to something else?" Derek looked at her with annoyance. "Are you kidding me? This is gold. Do you see how many people are watching? My phone has been buzzing nonstop with notifications. This is exactly the kind of content that's going to put me back on the map." "But look at him," Jenny said, gesturing toward the guard. "He's clearly struggling. This isn't funny anymore, it's just cruel." Derek followed her gaze and had to admit that the guard did look somewhat worse for wear. But instead of feeling sympathy, Derek saw this as evidence that his strategy was working. If the guard was starting to show signs of stress, it meant Derek was close to achieving his goal of making him break character. "That's exactly the point," Derek replied. "We're about to capture the moment when Mr. Perfect Soldier finally cracks. Do you have any idea how many views that's going to get? This could be the video that changes everything for my channel." Jenny shook her head in disgust. "I didn't sign up for this, Derek. I thought we were going to do pranks and social experiments, not torture someone who can't defend himself." "Torture?" Derek laughed. "I'm just talking. If he can't handle some words, then maybe he shouldn't have chosen a job that puts him in public view. This is what happens when you sign up to be a living symbol of an outdated monarchy. As their argument continued, Derek failed to notice that the guard had turned his head slightly to look at Jenny. It was a barely perceptible movement. What guard? Williams had broken his forward stare for just a moment to observe the young woman, who was trying to defend him. When Derek returned his attention to the guard, Williams had resumed his proper position, but something had changed in his expression. Where before there had been professional stoicism, now there was something that looked almost like gratitude, mixed with concern for Jenny's obvious distress. This subtle change in the guard's demeanor should have been Derek's cue to recognize that he was dealing with a real person with real emotions. But Derek was too focused on his content creation goals to pay attention to such nuances. "All right, everyone," Derek announced into his megaphone. "It's time to really test this guy's limits. I want to see what it takes to make a royal guard actually respond to provocation." Derek began to research facts about the royal guards on his phone, looking for information he could use to make his attacks more personal and specific. He discovered that many guards were military veterans who had served in combat zones before taking their ceremonial positions. "Oh, this is interesting," Derek said, reading from his phone screen. "It says here that a lot of you guys are former soldiers. So tell me, Guard Williams, did you see combat? Did you come back from some war zone and decide that the best use of your military training was to stand around and pose for pictures?" For the first time since Derek had begun his harassment, Guard Williams's composure showed a crack. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Derek caught a flash of something deeper in the young man's eyes. It wasn't anger exactly, but something more complex and painful. Derek sensed he had found a sensitive topic and decided to exploit it further. "I'm betting you've got some stories to tell," he continued, his voice taking on a mocking tone of false sympathy. "Some buddies who didn't make it home, and this is how you honor their memory? By playing dress-up for tourists?" Reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. Guard Williams's eyes filled with tears that he couldn't wipe away without breaking protocol. His breathing became slightly labored, and Derek could see him struggling to maintain his composure in the face of what was clearly a deeply personal attack. The crowd around them had gone quiet, sensing that something had shifted in the dynamic. Even some of Derek's supporters looked uncomfortable with the direction the confrontation had taken. Jenny grabbed Derek's arm. "Stop it," she hissed. "You're hurting him."
You see, you're hurting him.
But Derek was exhilarated by the guard's reaction. This was exactly what he had been working toward all morning. The moment when the perfect soldier facade cracked and revealed the vulnerable human being underneath. "Now we're getting somewhere," Derek said into his megaphone, his voice filled with triumph. "Look at that, folks. Turns out our stoic guardian has feelings after all. Who would have thought that bringing up dead soldiers would finally get a reaction?" The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several people in the crowd began to leave, clearly disgusted by Derek's behavior. But Derek was too caught up in his perceived victory to notice the shift in public opinion happening around him. What Derek also failed to notice was that his prolonged harassment had attracted attention from more than just curious onlookers. Palace security had been monitoring the situation, and several uniformed officers were now positioned at strategic points around the crowd. More importantly, Derek had no idea that among the people who had gathered to watch his performance was someone who would soon change the entire trajectory of his day in ways he never could have imagined. Derek was so focused on his performance and the guard's reaction that he completely missed the arrival of a distinguished elderly man who had been quietly observing the scene for the past 20 minutes. Colonel Robert Ashworth, retired from the British Army after 40 years of service, had been visiting London for a military reunion when he heard about the commotion at the palace. The colonel was not an imposing figure physically. At 73, he was of average height, with silver hair, and walked with a slight limp from an old war injury. But there was something in his bearing, a quiet authority that came from decades of leadership that caused people to instinctively step aside as he moved through the crowd. Derek continued his assault on Guard Williams, unaware that he was now being evaluated by someone with the experience to recognize both the guard's exceptional discipline and Derek's complete lack of character. "I'm genuinely curious now," Derek said into his megaphone, circling the guard like a shark sensing blood in the water. What do your military buddies think about your career choice? Do they respect you for taking the easy job, or do they think you're wasting the training they all paid for with their sacrifice? Guard Williams was clearly struggling now. Tears continued to well in his eyes, and his breathing had become more labored. But his posture remained perfect, and he continued to stare straight ahead. Maintaining his post despite the psychological torture Derek was inflicting, Colonel Ashworth stepped closer, his trained eye taking in every detail of the situation. He recognized the signs of a soldier under extreme duress, and he also recognized the type of person Derek represented. The colonel had encountered bullies before in military and civilian contexts, and he understood exactly how to deal with them. What we have here, Derek announced to his audience, is a perfect example of what's wrong with traditional institutions. This young man has been so thoroughly conditioned to follow orders that he's lost his basic human dignity. He'll stand there and take any abuse, rather than assert himself as an individual. Derek's phone was buzzing constantly with notifications. As clips of his performance spread across social media, he was getting the attention he craved. But he was too intoxicated by his perceived success to realize that much of the reaction was negative. Jenny had given up trying to reason with Derek, and was now standing apart from him, clearly distancing herself from his behavior. She looked ashamed to be associated with what was happening, and several people in the crowd had approached her to express their disgust with Derek's actions. The thing that really bothers me, Derek continued, is that people actually admire this kind of mindless obedience. They think it's noble or honorable to stand there like a robot while someone points out your obvious failures as a human being. Colonel Ashworth had heard enough. He approached Derek from behind, his movement so quiet and controlled that Derek didn't notice his presence until the colonel was directly beside him. "Excuse me, young man," the colonel said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. Derek turned, annoyed by the interruption. "I'm kind of busy here, Grandpa. If you want to talk, you'll have to wait until I'm finished with my content." The colonel studied Derek's face for a moment, taking in his arrogant expression and dismissive attitude. "I see. And what exactly is the nature of your content?" Derek gestured toward Guard Williams with his megaphone. "I'm showing people what happens when you poke holes in the facade of these so-called elite soldiers. Turns out they're just as fragile as everyone else." "Interesting perspective," the colonel said, his tone remaining conversational. "Tell me, what's your background with military service?" Derek laughed. "Military service? Are you kidding me? I'm way too smart to fall for that propaganda. I create content that actually matters, that actually changes people's perspectives on important issues." "I see," the colonel repeated. "And you believe that humiliating a young soldier who cannot defend himself constitutes important content?" "Look, old man," Derek said, his patience wearing thin, "I don't have time to explain the nuances of social media strategy to someone who probably still reads newspapers. This is how modern activism works." The colonel nodded thoughtfully. "Modern activism. How fascinating. And tell me, have you considered the possibility that this young guard might have earned his position through actual sacrifice and service?" Derek rolled his eyes. "What sacrifice? Standing around in a costume? Please. If you want to see real sacrifice, look at content creators like me who risk everything to bring truth to the masses." Several people in the crowd had now turned their attention to this new conversation, sensing that something significant was developing. Colonel Ashworth's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Derek's aggressive energy, and the contrast was becoming more pronounced with each exchange. "Risk everything," the colonel mused. That's an interesting phrase. "What exactly have you risked in your career as a content creator?" Derek gestured expansively. "My reputation, my financial security, my personal safety. Every time I create controversial content, I'm putting myself on the line to challenge the status quo." "Personal safety," the colonel said, his eyebrows raising slightly. "Have you ever been shot at, Mr. Matthews?" "Derek Matthews? And no, I haven't been shot at, but I've received death threats from people who can't handle having their comfortable worldviews challenged." The colonel looked over at Guard Williams, who was still maintaining his position despite his obvious distress. "Young man," he said, addressing Derek, "would you be surprised to learn that the guard you've been tormenting for the past 2 hours, was awarded the Military Cross for extraordinary bravery in Afghanistan? Derek scoffed. Even if that's true, which I doubt, it doesn't change the fact that he's wasting his life now standing around like a mannequin. The Military Cross, the colonel continued, ignoring Derek's dismissal, is awarded for exemplary gallantry during active operations against the enemy. Guard Williams received his after single-handedly holding a strategic position for 6 hours while under constant enemy fire, allowing his unit to evacuate wounded civilians. The crowd had gone completely silent now, hanging on every word of the colonel's quiet revelation. Derek suddenly felt less confident than he had moments before. 3 of his fellow soldiers died in that action, the colonel continued. Williams himself was wounded but refused medical evacuation until every civilian was safely out of the combat zone. Derek looked over at Guard Williams, seeing him now with different eyes. The young man's composure, which Derek had been trying to break, suddenly seemed less like mindless obedience and more like extraordinary strength of character. But that's not the most remarkable part of his story, the colonel said, his voice carrying clearly across the now quiet crowd. After recovering from his wounds, Private Williams requested assignment to ceremonial duties, specifically because he wanted to serve his country in a way that honored peace rather than war. Derek felt the megaphone growing heavy in his hands, as the full weight of his behavior began to settle on him. The silence that followed Colonel Ashworth's revelation was deafening. Derek stood frozen, the megaphone suddenly feeling like it weighed 100 pounds in his hands. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 200 people, all of whom had heard the colonel's words about Guard Williams's true background and service record. Derek's mind raced as he tried to process what he had just learned. The young man he had been tormenting for hours wasn't some lazy ceremonial figure living off taxpayer money. He was a decorated war hero who had seen actual combat, lost friends, and chosen to continue serving his country in a peaceful capacity. "I don't believe you," Derek said finally, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried just moments before. "You're just making that up to make me look bad." Colonel Ashworth reached into his jacket and withdrew a smartphone. "Would you like me to show you the official military records? Or perhaps you'd prefer to see the newspaper articles from when Guard Williams received his decoration?" Derek's throat felt dry. He glanced around at the crowd and realized that their expressions had changed dramatically. Where before there had been a mixture of entertainment and disgust, now there was uniform condemnation directed squarely at him. "Even if that's all true," Derek said, desperately trying to regain control of the situation, "it doesn't change the fact that he's wasting his talents now. Why stand around playing soldier when he could be doing something productive?" Colonel's expression hardened slightly. "Something productive? Tell me, Mr. Matthews, what do you consider productive?" "Humiliating people who cannot defend themselves. Creating content that spreads cruelty and mockery?" Derek felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead. "Despite the cool weather, I create content that makes people think. I challenge authority and expose hypocrisy. That's more valuable than standing around in a costume." "You challenge authority," the colonel repeated slowly.
Ow!
"Exactly does mocking a young veteran challenge authority. What hypocrisy are you exposing by making jokes about his service?" It questions hit Derek like physical blows. He realized that he had no good answers, that his behavior couldn't be justified as social commentary or activism. It was simply cruelty for entertainment, nothing more. A woman in the crowd called out, "Shame on you! That boy served his country. While you were probably sitting at home making videos." Other voices joined in, expressing similar sentiments. Derek realized that the crowd was turning against him, and turning decisively. His phone was still buzzing with notifications, but he was beginning to suspect that the attention he was receiving wasn't the kind he had hoped for. "You don't understand," Derek said into his megaphone, his voice becoming defensive. "This is how social media works. You have to push boundaries to get people's attention. Everyone does it." "Everyone does not do it," the colonel said firmly. "Most people understand that there are lines that shouldn't be crossed, boundaries that separate legitimate criticism from simple cruelty." Derek looked over at Guard Williams, who was still maintaining his position despite everything he had endured. The tears in the young man's eyes had dried, but Derek could see the pain that his words had caused. For the first time, Derek felt something that might have been genuine remorse. "Look," Derek said, his voice dropping to a more normal volume. Maybe I got a little carried away. But it's not like I actually heard him. They're just words. The colonel stepped closer to Derek, his voice becoming more intense. Just words? Do you have any idea what this young man has been through? Do you understand what it means to watch your friends die, to carry that weight every day, and then to have someone mock their sacrifice for entertainment? Derek felt his confidence crumbling completely. The colonel's words were cutting through, his defenses like a knife, exposing the hollowness of his justifications. Guard Williams, the colonel said, turning toward the young soldier, chose ceremonial duty because he wanted to serve something beautiful instead of destructive. He wanted to represent the dignity and honor that his fallen friends died protecting. Crowd murmured its approval of the colonel's words. Derek realized that he had completely misread the situation from the beginning. These people weren't here to be entertained by his cruelty. They were here to witness what they hoped would be his comeuppance. Jenny, Derek's assistant, approached him with tears in her eyes. Derek, we need to stop this. We need to apologize. And leave. This has gone way too far. But Derek was trapped now. His entire online persona was built on never backing down, never admitting weakness or error. If he apologized now, if he showed vulnerability, his audience might abandon him completely. I'm not apologizing for exercising my right to free speech, Derek said, though his voice shook slightly. If he can't handle criticism, then maybe he shouldn't have chosen such a public job. The colonel's eyes flashed with anger for the first time since the conversation began. Criticism? Is that what you call this? You spent 2 hours systematically attempting to destroy this young man's dignity, and you call it criticism? Derek realized he was losing control of the narrative. Completely. His phone was buzzing more frantically than ever, and he was afraid to look at the comments and messages he was receiving. You want to know about real service? Colonel continued, his voice rising slightly. Real service means putting others before yourself. It means sacrificing your comfort, your safety, sometimes your life, for something greater than your own immediate gratification. The colonel gestured toward Guard Williams. That young man has served with distinction in one of the most dangerous places on earth. He's seen things that would break most people, and he's chosen to continue serving in a way that honors peace and tradition. Derek felt smaller with each word the colonel spoke. His megaphone, which had felt like a weapon of power just minutes before, now felt like a ridiculous prop in a performance that had gone horribly wrong. And you, the colonel said, turning his full attention back to Derek, what have you contributed to society? What have you built? What have you protected? What legacy will you leave behind besides videos of yourself tormenting people who cannot defend themselves? The questions hung in the air like accusations. Derek realized that hundreds of people were waiting for his answer, and he had no idea what to say. For the first time in years, Derek Matthews was completely speechless. Derek's silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The crowd waited, watching him struggle to find words that might justify his behavior or restore his dignity. But nothing came. The megaphone in his hands had become a symbol of his own moral bankruptcy. He couldn't bring himself to use it. Colonel Ashworth seemed to sense Derek's internal collapse and pressed his advantage. You speak of challenging authority, Mr. Matthews, but the only authority you've challenged today is your own moral compass. You've used technology and anonymity to become a bully, nothing more. Derek's phone buzzed again, and this time he couldn't resist looking at it. The notifications were coming in faster than he could read them, but the tone was clear. Comments like disgusting behavior, this guy is a monster, and someone needs to teach this bully a lesson, filled his screen. The viral fame Derek had been seeking was finally within his grasp, but not in the way he had imagined. He was becoming infamous for all the wrong reasons. His name was trending on social media, but associated with words like cruel, coward, and pathetic. Jenny approached him again, her face pale with worry. Derek, we need to leave now. This is getting out of control, and I'm scared about what might happen next. But Derek was transfixed by his phone, watching his reputation crumble in real time. Video clips of his harassment were being shared thousands of times, but now they were accompanied by Colonel Ashworth's revelations about Guard Williams's true service record. The interesting thing about modern technology, the colonel said, apparently reading Derek's thoughts, is how quickly information can spread. I imagine quite a few people are learning about Guard Williams's actual military service right about now. Derek looked up from his phone to see that many people in the crowd were indeed on their devices, sharing and commenting on what they were witnessing. But instead of supporting Derek's content, they were providing context that made his behavior look even worse. A young woman in the crowd called out, "My brother served in Afghanistan too. How dare you mock someone who risked his life for our freedom?" Other voices joined in, sharing their own connections to military service and expressing their outrage at Derek's behavior. Derek realized that he had inadvertently created a situation where his cruelty was being broadcast to an audience that included many people with personal stakes in respecting military service. "I think it's time you left," the colonel said quietly, but his voice carried clearly in the tense atmosphere. "You've done enough damage for one day." Derek wanted to leave, desperately wanted to escape the judgment and condemnation surrounding him, but his pride wouldn't let him simply slink away in defeat. His entire online persona was built on never backing down, never showing weakness. "I have just as much right to be here as anyone else," Derek said, his voice cracking slightly. "This is public property, and I'm exercising my legal rights." "Legal rights," the colonel mused. "Yes, you certainly have the legal right to make a fool of yourself in public. But having the right to do something and having the wisdom to do it are very different things."
Oh.
Derek felt trapped between his pride and his growing awareness that he had made a terrible mistake. The crowd was becoming more hostile by the minute, and he was beginning to fear for his actual physical safety. Guard Williams, meanwhile, remained at his post despite everything he had endured. His composure had returned somewhat, though Derek could still see the pain in his eyes. The young soldier's dedication to his duty, even after being subjected to such cruelty, made Derek's behavior look even more petty and meaningless. "Look at him," the colonel said, gesturing toward the guard. "After everything you've put him through, he's still doing his job. He's still serving with dignity and honor. Can you say the same about your own conduct today?" Derek's assistant, Jenny, suddenly stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she said, addressing Guard Williams directly. "I'm so sorry for what we've done to you. You didn't deserve any of this." The apology that Derek couldn't bring himself to make came from Jenny instead, and the crowd responded with approval. Several people began to applaud her courage in distancing herself from Derek's behavior. Derek felt completely isolated now. Even his own assistant had abandoned him, recognizing that his behavior was indefensible. He was standing alone in the middle of a crowd of people who viewed him with contempt and disgust. His phone buzzed with a notification that made his blood run cold. Someone had identified him by name and location, was sharing his personal information along with the videos of his harassment. The anonymous protection that social media usually provided was disappearing as people worked to hold him accountable for his actions. "This is harassment," Derek said weakly, holding up his phone to show the colonel. "People are doxing me and threatening me. This is illegal." The colonel looked at the phone screen and then back at Derek with an expression of complete incredulity. "You're concerned about harassment? For after spending 2 hours systematically attempting to break down a young veteran who couldn't defend himself?" Derek realized how his complaint sounded and fell silent again. He was receiving the same kind of attention he had subjected others to, and he didn't like how it felt. The difference was that his victims had always been powerless to fight back. While he had chosen to make himself a public figure, the crowd began to chant, "Apologize. Apologize." Their voices created a rhythmic demand that echoed off the palace walls. Derek looked around at the sea of faces surrounding him, while demanding that he take responsibility for his actions. Colonel Ashworth stepped closer to Derek, his voice dropping to a level that only Derek could hear. "Son, you have a choice to make right now. You can continue down this path and become known forever as the man who tormented a war hero for entertainment. Or you can show some courage of your own and make this right." Derek stared at the colonel, then at Guard Williams, then at the crowd. A people waiting for him to do the right thing. For the first time in his adult life, Derek Matthews was faced with a situation where his usual tactics wouldn't work, where he couldn't manipulate or deflect his way out of consequences. The megaphone felt impossibly heavy in his hands as he realized that his next words would define not just this moment, but potentially the rest of his life. Derek stood in the center of the hostile crowd, the weight of hundreds of judgmental stares pressing down on him like a physical force. The megaphone in his hands had become a symbol of everything he had done wrong, and the colonel's words echoed. In his mind, you can show some courage of your own and make this right. For 32 years, Derek had lived by a simple philosophy: never apologize, never show weakness, never back down. It had served him well in the ruthless world of social media, where vulnerability was often seen as blood in the water. But standing here now, faced with the consequences of his cruelty, that philosophy felt as hollow and meaningless as his content. The chanting continued. Apologize. Apologize. The rhythm was hypnotic and relentless, like the beating of his own guilty conscience. Derek looked at Guard Williams, still standing at perfect attention despite everything he had endured. The young soldier's eyes were no longer filled with tears, but Derek could see something there that was almost worse. Disappointment. Not anger, not hatred, but a deep sadness that someone could be so thoughtlessly cruel. Jenny had moved away from him entirely now, standing with a group of people who were comforting her and praising her for speaking out. Derek realized that he had lost not just his assistant, but probably one of the few genuine friends he had left. His pursuit of viral fame had cost him more than he had ever imagined it could. Derek's phone continued to buzz incessantly. His notifications showed that clips of the confrontation had now been viewed millions of times across multiple platforms. But instead of the admiring comments and subscriber growth he had always craved, the response was overwhelmingly negative. People were calling for boycotts of his channel, demanding that social media platforms ban him permanently, and sharing information about how to support veterans organizations in Guard Williams's honor. Colonel Ashworth remained standing beside Derek, not speaking now, just waiting. The old soldier seemed to understand that Derek was fighting the most important battle of his life, and it was a battle that could only be won by surrendering his pride. Derek looked down at the megaphone in his hands. This simple device had amplified not just his voice, but his worst impulses. It had turned him into someone he barely recognized, someone who could spend 2 hours systematically trying to destroy another person's dignity for entertainment. Slowly, Derek set the megaphone down on the ground. The gesture was small, but it felt monumental. For the first time since he had started creating content, Derek was choosing to make himself smaller rather than louder. The crowd noticed the gesture and began to quiet down, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Derek looked up at Guard Williams, meeting the young soldier's eyes directly for the first time all day. "Guard Williams," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I owe you an apology that I can never adequately express." The words felt foreign in Derek's mouth. He couldn't remember the last time he had apologized for anything, let alone in front of hundreds of people and countless social media viewers. "I came here today thinking I was clever, thinking I was providing entertainment by mocking what I saw as an easy target." Derek's voice grew stronger as he continued. "But I wasn't clever. I was cruel. I was cowardly. Spent 2 hours attacking someone who couldn't defend himself. And I convinced myself it was justified because it would get me views and subscribers." The crowd remained silent, hanging on every word. Derek could see people recording him, but for once he didn't care about how he looked on camera. "Colonel Ashworth told me about your service, about your courage in Afghanistan, about the friends you lost." Derek's voice cracked slightly. "And I realized that while you were risking your life to protect others, I was sitting safely at home making videos. While you were serving something greater than yourself, I was serving only my own ego." Derek took a deep breath and looked around. At the crowd, spent years building a career on tearing people down, on finding their weaknesses and exploiting them for content. I told myself it was social commentary, that I was challenging authority and making people think. But the truth is, I was just a bully with a camera. Guard Williams's expression had softened slightly, though he maintained his professional posture. Derek could see something that might have been forgiveness beginning to form in the young soldier's eyes. "I can't undo what I've done today," Derek continued. "I can't take back the words I said or the pain I caused, but I can promise that I'll do better. I can promise that I'll use whatever platform I have left to support veterans, and to speak out against the kind of cruelty I showed today. Derek reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Without hesitation, he opened his social media apps and began deleting his accounts one by one. Years of content, millions of views, hundreds of thousands of followers, all gone with a few taps on his screen. The crowd murmured in surprise as word spread about what Derek was doing. This wasn't just an apology. It was the public dismantling of his entire online persona. "I'm done," Derek announced to the crowd. "I'm done making content that hurts people. I'm done profiting from cruelty. If I'm going to have any kind of platform in the future, it's going to be one that builds people up instead of tearing them down." Colonel Ashworth stepped forward and placed a hand on Derek's shoulder. "That takes real courage, son. More courage than most people ever show in their entire lives." Derek looked at the colonel with tears in his eyes. "It doesn't feel like courage. It feels like the bare minimum of human decency." "Sometimes," the colonel said quietly, "those are the same thing." The crowd began to disperse, but not before. Many people approached Derek to shake his hand or offer words of encouragement for his decision to change course. Some remained skeptical, and Derek understood their doubt. He'd spent years building a reputation for cruelty. It would take much longer to build one for compassion. Jenny approached him as the crowd thinned out. "Derek, I'm proud of you for doing the right thing, but I can't work with you anymore. I need to find something that aligns with my values." Derek nodded, understanding completely. "I know, and you should. You deserve to work on projects that make the world better, not worse." As the sun began to set over London, Derek found himself almost alone with Guard Williams, who was finally being relieved by another soldier. Young veteran walked over to Derek, his ceremonial composure replaced by genuine human warmth. "Mr. Matthews, Guard," Williams said, extending his hand. "Thank you for apologizing. It takes a big person to admit when they're wrong, especially so publicly." Derek shook the guard's hand, fighting back tears. "I'm sorry. I was so cruel. I'm sorry I brought up your friends, your service. I had no right. We all make mistakes," Williams replied. "What matters is what we do after we realize we've made them." 6 months later, Derek was working at a small nonprofit organization that provided support services to military veterans. His social media following was gone, his income had disappeared, and his former lifestyle was a memory. But for the first time in years, Derek Matthews could look at himself in the mirror and feel something resembling pride. He had learned that attention wasn't the most valuable currency in the world, after all. Character was. And while he had spent years broadcasting his worst impulses to the world, he was now quietly rebuilding his character one day at a time. Far from the cameras and the crowd, the viral fame he had always craved had finally found him, but not in the way he had expected. He was remembered not for his cleverness or his controversial content, but for the moment he chose to become a better person. And surprisingly, that turned out to be worth more than all the views and subscribers he had ever accumulated. In the end, Derek discovered that the most important audience for his transformation wasn't online. It was the man looking back at him in the mirror each morning, learning to respect the person he was becoming instead of mourning the person he had been.